Have you ever wondered what happens when a man loses everything and still chooses to do what's right? This is the story of a single father, a man who gave up his future to save a stranger in the middle of chaos. Years later, when hope was gone, God sent him something he never expected. A miracle born not of light, but of kindness, love, and forgiveness. Before you watch, take a moment to breathe, because what you're about to see might remind you that even the darkest nights can still end in dawn. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe, share it with someone who needs faith today, and help us spread hope to the world. Thank you for being here. May God bless you for every second of compassion you give. San Francisco woke to a trembling quiet that morning. The fog had rolled in heavy from the bay, draping itself over the steel bridges and glass towers like a weary traveler who refused to leave. The air carried the salt of the ocean and the distant hum of early commuters. It was the kind of dawn that felt suspended, too still for comfort, too pale to promise warmth. Beneath that silver sky, Ethan Miller stirred awake in his small Mission District apartment, unaware that by sundown, the rhythm of his life would shift forever. Ethan was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose presence filled a room quietly. His face bore the faint stubble of someone too busy to care much about mirrors, and his dark blonde hair had begun to show early streaks of gray near the temples. There was a calm steadiness in his brown eyes, though lines of fatigue cut deep beneath them, remnants of too many late nights fixing things that refused to stay fixed. Once, before the years of struggle, he'd been an optimist who believed every problem had a mechanical solution. Then life had shown him otherwise. On the dresser beside his bed sat a photograph of Sarah, his late wife, a woman of delicate build and quiet warmth. She'd had auburn hair that always smelled faintly of vanilla, and a smile that could turn his worst day into something worth surviving. Sarah had been a nurse, tireless and gentle, the sort of person who remembered everyone's birthday on the hospital floor. She died 7 years ago, giving birth to their son, and though time had dulled the sharpest edges of grief, it had never left him. Ethan carried her absence like a carefully folded note in his pocket, never spoken of, but always there. From the next room came the rustling sound of small feet and a yawn. Noah, 7 years old, thin and freckle-faced, with a mop of sandy hair, peeked around the doorway, rubbing his eyes. His pajamas were covered in cartoon rockets, a birthday gift from one of the neighbors. Noah had inherited his mother's kindness and his father's quiet focus. He was the kind of boy who fixed broken toys for other kids instead of throwing his own tantrums. "Morning, Daddy," he mumbled. "Morning, buddy." Ethan smiled, even as he fought the tightness in his chest. Today mattered, more than any day in years. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast. It was cramped enough that father and son had to take turns moving around the counter, but it was home. On the small table lay a robot Noah had built from scraps of cardboard and wires scavenged from old radios. One leg dangled by a thread of tape. Ethan picked it up gently and tightened the joint with a paperclip. "Fixed," he said softly. "Just needed someone stubborn enough not to quit." "Like you?" Noah asked. "Exactly like me." This morning, Ethan wore the only suit he owned, a gray one, slightly shiny at the elbows but pressed carefully. He'd saved it for occasions that required him to look like someone whose life was in control. The interview at Harrington Industries was in less than 3 hours. If he got the position, his salary would triple. They could finally move out of this apartment with the thin walls and flickering lights. Maybe he could even afford the piano lessons Noah had been begging for. Noah climbed onto a chair, swinging his legs as he ate scrambled eggs from a chipped blue plate. "If you get the new job," he said through a mouthful of toast, "can we have pizza every Friday?" Ethan chuckled. "Pizza every Friday, that's the deal." He reached out and brushed a crumb from his son's cheek. There was an ache behind the humor, though, one that never fully disappeared. He wanted Noah to have a childhood untouched by worry, even if that meant carrying the weight alone. By 7:30, they were out the door. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing the city's fractured beauty. Street art fading on brick walls, trolley wires stretching overhead like veins, the smell of roasted beans from the cafe downstairs. Ethan held Noah's hand as they crossed the street toward the school gates. At the entrance, a teacher waved and smiled. Noah turned to hug his father tightly. "Good luck, Daddy. You're the best engineer in the whole world." Ethan knelt to meet his gaze. "And you're the best kid in the whole world. I'll see you at 3. As he watched Noah disappear through the doors, Ethan exhaled slowly. The future felt both terrifying and close enough to touch. He turned toward the BART station and joined the flow of commuters, his portfolio tucked carefully under one arm. The train ride downtown was a blur of motion and reflection. Ethan reviewed the blueprints in his folder, his ideas for modular bridge supports, efficient and low cost, the sort of innovation that had caught the eye of Harrington's recruitment team. If everything went right, this would be the day he stepped out from the shadows of barely getting by. When he emerged onto Montgomery Street, the skyscrapers loomed against the thinning mist. The air was crisp now, sunlight glinting off car roofs and glass panes. The Harrington Industries Tower stood a few blocks ahead, all steel and precision, its mirrored surface reflecting a city forever reaching upward. Ethan checked his watch. 9:15 a.m., 15 minutes to spare. And then the ground moved. At first it was subtle, like the tremor of a passing truck. Then it deepened, the pavement cracking with a guttural roar. Windows rattled. Sirens blared. People screamed as the earth beneath them pitched like a ship in a storm. Ethan stumbled, catching himself against a streetlight as glass rained from above. A delivery van skidded sideways, smashing into a hydrant that burst open, sending water gushing into the air. The quake lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to scatter the city into chaos when it finally stilled. Smoke and dust curled upward in the distance. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He could still make the interview. He was only a block away. He gathered his scattered papers, his mind already rehearsing excuses for being late. Then came the sound that froze him. A voice, faint, hoarse, buried somewhere amid the rubble. "Help, please." Ethan turned. In the narrow alley between two fallen walls, dust swirling like fog, lay a man pinned beneath a slab of concrete. He was older, perhaps late 50s, his once impeccable navy suit torn and coated in gray dust. Blood seeped down his forehead from a deep cut, tracing through the lines of a weathered face that spoke of decades of command. His eyes, sharp blue even through pain, met Ethan's. "I can't move my leg." Ethan dropped his portfolio without thinking. The man's breathing was shallow. Judging by the debris, the concrete weighed at least 200 pounds. Years of engineering instinct took over. "You're going to be okay," he said, scanning the area for leverage. "Just hold on." He found a broken metal rod and wedged it beneath the slab, using a chunk of wood as fulcrum. Sweat streaked through the dust on his face as he pushed down with all his strength. The concrete shifted slightly, enough for him to slide his jacket under the man's leg, easing the pressure. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his arms. "Richard," the man gasped. "Richard Harrington." The name struck Ethan like a jolt. The CEO, the man he'd come here to impress, now bleeding and helpless before him. "Stay with me," Ethan said. He tore off his tie and wound it tightly around Richard's thigh above the wound to slow the bleeding. His fingers were slick with blood, his suit ruined, but his focus was unbroken. From somewhere down the street came the distant wail of sirens. Minutes passed like hours until the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed in, shouting orders, lifting the slab with hydraulic jacks. As they loaded Richard onto a stretcher, one of them clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "You probably saved his life, man." Ethan nodded, too stunned to speak. His tie was gone, his jacket torn, his hands trembling. He watched as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the siren faded into the distance. The street around him was littered with glass and paper, the remnants of a city that had momentarily forgotten how to stand still. He looked down at himself, shirt ripped, palms cut, blood on his cuffs. The interview was over before it began. Yet, as he stood there in the smoky aftermath, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not despair, not even regret, but a quiet certainty that he'd made the only choice he could have lived with. He turned toward the skyline, where the sun was breaking through the thinning clouds. Somewhere in the distance, the ambulance carried away the man whose fate had just entwined with his own. Ethan took a long breath, the air thick with dust and promise, and began the long walk home, unaware that this morning, born of chaos and courage, had just rewritten the story of his life. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Morning light streamed through half-closed blinds, striping the pale walls with gold and shadow. Richard Harrington lay propped up on crisp white pillows, his leg wrapped in bandages, the faint beeping of a heart monitor keeping time with his slow, steady breaths. For a man who had built an empire on decisiveness, he looked startlingly fragile. His once immaculate hair, silver streaked with darker strands, was now unruly, and his face bore the bruised discoloration of survival. Richard was 60, tall even when seated, broad-shouldered, with a presence that usually filled a room before he spoke. His blue-gray eyes, sharp and analytical, had once commanded boardrooms and silenced competitors. But that morning, they looked elsewhere, beyond power, beyond profit, fixed on the memory of a stranger's hands pulling him from the rubble. Nurses moved quietly around him, adjusting IV lines and checking monitors. One of them, a young woman named Martha, spoke softly, telling him he'd been lucky, that another few minutes without help and the bleeding might have turned fatal. Richard only nodded, the words barely registering. In his mind replayed the moment he saw the man's face through the dust. Focused, calm, determined. "Ethan Miller," the nurse had said after checking his hospital records. The man had left before anyone could thank him. 3 days later, Richard was discharged against the advice of his doctors. He insisted he had work to do, and no one argued. People rarely did. His driver, a graying man named Tom Avery, opened the door of the black sedan parked outside the hospital. Tom had worked for Richard for over 20 years, loyal to a fault. He was short, with a round face and a quiet patience that made him more of a companion than an employee. "You shouldn't be up and about yet, sir," Tom muttered, his voice low but firm. "I've been lying down long enough," Richard replied, his tone weary but resolute. He stared out the window as the car moved through the city streets still scarred from the quake. Cracked sidewalks, boarded windows, cranes hovering above half-collapsed buildings. San Francisco was rebuilding, and so in a way, was he. Back in his office atop the Harrington Industries Tower, the familiar scent of polished mahogany and espresso greeted him. The skyline stretched out in all directions, the bay gleaming in the distance. Yet for the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of emptiness inside the room. His assistant, Laura Jensen, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and an even sharper memory, briefed him on the company's recovery efforts. Structural division lost some data from the downtown servers, but backups were intact. Also, the final interviews for the engineering position were canceled, as you instructed. Richard froze mid-sentence. Canceled? Yes, sir. One of the candidates, Ethan Miller, I believe, was listed among them. Laura tilted her head, curious. Why do you ask? Richard said nothing for a long moment, then quietly, because I owe that man my life. Later that afternoon, Richard instructed Tom to drive him to the Mission District. They stopped in front of a worn 3-story building, its paint peeling, the faint hum of traffic filling the air. Richard stepped out slowly, using a cane. He glanced around until he found the name Miller on a rusted mailbox. From across the street, he saw Ethan exiting the building, his son Noah skipping beside him, holding a paper robot. Ethan wore the same gray suit, now cleaned but still threadbare, the cuffs slightly frayed. He walked with purpose, not pride, a man surviving one day at a time. Richard didn't approach immediately. Instead, he observed. He watched Ethan kneel to fix Noah's shoelace, smile, and say something that made the boy laugh. It was a small, tender moment that stirred something in Richard's chest, a memory of what it felt like to care for someone without condition. That evening, back in his mansion on the northern edge of the city, Richard found his sister Claire Harrington painting in the conservatory. The room glowed with soft sunset light, the scent of oil paint mixing with blooming jasmine outside the glass walls. Claire was 33, tall and willowy, with long chestnut hair that fell in loose waves over her shoulders. Her skin was pale, her eyes the same blue-gray as her brother's, but gentler, more reflective. She wore a paint-streaked apron over a white blouse, her bare feet tucked beneath her chair. "Back from the hospital already?" she asked, her tone calm but tinged with concern. "Couldn't stay there any longer." Richard eased into a seat. "Doctors make terrible company." Claire smiled faintly, but didn't look up from her canvas, a half-finished landscape of vineyards under a gray sky. "You shouldn't push yourself." "I met the man who saved my life," Richard said suddenly. "Or rather, I found out who he is." Claire set down her brush. "And?" "His name's Ethan Miller, mechanical engineer. Lost his wife years ago during childbirth, raising his boy alone." Claire's expression softened. "That's sad. He reminds me of someone." Richard's voice dropped, the air thickening between them. He didn't need to say who. The name Michael, Claire's late husband, hung unspoken in the space like a ghost. Michael had died 3 years earlier in another earthquake south of Napa, the same disaster that took their infant son. Since then, Claire had retreated from the world. Her only steady companion, a large German shepherd named Max, 6 years old, sable-colored with dark, intelligent eyes. Max entered the room now, padding across the floor to rest his head on Claire's knee. He was tall, muscular, and watchful, the kind of dog that didn't simply protect, but understood. Richard reached down to scratch Max's head. The dog tolerated it, but quickly turned back to his mistress, ever loyal. "He doesn't trust many people," Richard said. "He doesn't have to," Claire replied softly, stroking Max's fur. He's all I need. Richard studied his sister a long while, the lines of grief still shadowing her beauty. Maybe, he said slowly, but I think it's time someone reminded you that life isn't meant to be lived in mourning. Claire met his gaze for the first time. What are you suggesting? I want you to meet Ethan. She frowned. Because he saved your life? Because he understands loss the way you do, and because good men are rare. Claire's eyes flicked toward the window where the last light was fading behind the hills. I don't need saving, Richard. I didn't say you did. His tone was gentle but firm. Just dinner, one evening, for me. She hesitated, then nodded once. One evening. Outside, the first stars appeared above the recovering city. Inside, Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling a rare sense of calm. He didn't know exactly why he wanted these two broken souls to meet. Perhaps because he saw in them the possibility of something he himself no longer believed in. Healing. As Claire turned back to her painting, Max lifted his head, sensing something new in the air, something not yet named. And in the heart of San Francisco, two lives, one bound by gratitude, the other by grief, moved quietly toward the moment they would finally cross. The road that cut through Boulder Creek was a thin ribbon of asphalt coiling between redwood trees and fog. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through the canopy, scattering across the hood of an old Ford pickup that rumbled its way up the incline. Behind the wheel sat Jack Turner, his eyes hard and narrow beneath the brim of a weathered hat. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and lean, with a square jaw covered in a few days' stubble, and the kind of face that looked carved by years rather than time. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with gray, and his hands bore the rough calluses of someone who'd worked with both tools and weapons. There was an edge to Jack, not cruelty, but a sharpness forged from regret. Beside him, Clara, a woman in her late 20s, sat pressed against the passenger door, clutching her injured shoulder. Her hair, a cascade of chestnut waves now tangled and damp, stuck to her pale cheeks. She wore a torn denim jacket over a faded sundress, the fabric soaked through with blood near her collarbone. Clara had that sort of fragile beauty that didn't invite admiration so much as protection, wide green eyes that carried a quiet strength even through fear. She was shaking, but not crying. She had stopped crying hours ago, somewhere between the shattered warehouse and the forest road. Behind them, in the back seat, Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, shifted restlessly. His fur gleamed under the faint light, a mix of sable and black, and his amber eyes flicked constantly to the mirrors. He was large for his breed, his chest deep, his muscles corded under the thick coat. Every so often a low growl rumbled from his throat. Jack reached back, brushing his fingers through the coarse fur. Easy, boy. We're almost there. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The truck's tires hissed over the damp road, the forest pressing close on both sides. The storm that had been gathering all day finally broke with a low roll of thunder. Rain splattered the windshield, the wipers squealing in protest. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. At first he thought it was the fog playing tricks, but then the shape emerged, a black pickup, its headlights cutting through the gray distance. Someone's following us, Clara whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion. I know. Jack downshifted, the engine growling. His pulse quickened, not out of fear, but memory. Years ago, that same sound, that same smell of rain and gasoline, had filled the air the night everything fell apart. Before he was a man driving a stranger through the fog, Jack had been Sheriff Turner of Boulder Creek, A decorated officer, respected, calm under pressure, until the night the fire came. His only daughter, Lena, had been trapped in a house blaze caused by a drug bust gone wrong. He had been seconds too late. The smoke and the screaming still woke him sometimes, like the ghost of a siren that never stopped. After that, the badge felt heavier than his heart could carry, and he'd left without saying goodbye. Now, years later, the past had caught up in the form of headlights cutting through rain. The pursuing truck accelerated, closing the distance. Clara's breathing quickened. "Who are they?" "Don't know," Jack muttered, though his jaw tightened. "But they don't want to talk." Rex growled louder this time, lips curled, his body rigid. The road ahead narrowed, winding along a steep drop. Jack's mind worked fast, calculating. No backup, no radio, and an injured woman beside him. He pressed the accelerator. The engine roared, the truck lurching forward as rain hammered harder against the glass. The black truck's lights grew brighter, flashing once. A warning or a taunt. "Hold on," Jack said, gripping the wheel tighter. He swung the pickup around a curve, tires skidding on slick asphalt. Clara let out a small cry as she braced against the door. A bullet hit the rear bumper with a metallic clang. "They're shooting at us!" "I noticed." Jack's voice was grim but steady. He reached under the seat and pulled out an old Colt .45, the metal dull and worn smooth by time. It was the same weapon he'd locked away a decade ago, swearing never to use again. His thumb traced the grip, and for a heartbeat, he saw it. The firelight, the smoke, the flames licking against the badge that had once been pinned to his chest. Clara stared at him, blood and rain streaking down her neck. "You used to be a cop." "Used to be," Jack said, eyes still on the road. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees for a heartbeat. Towering, silent witnesses to old sins and new danger. The black truck swerved again, bumping their tailgate. Jack fired once out the back window. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the canyon. Glass shattered. The pursuing lights jerked, swerved, then steadied again. Whoever they weren't backing off. Rex barked furiously, claws scraping the seat. "Rex, down!" Jack shouted. The dog obeyed but stayed alert, ears flat, gaze locked on the threat behind. Up ahead, the road split. One path toward town, the other toward the old quarry, long abandoned and half swallowed by forest. Jack made the choice instantly. He turned off the headlights and veered right, the tires kicking up gravel as they plunged into darkness. The black truck hesitated, its beams sweeping past before disappearing into the opposite turn. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain and Clara's trembling breath. They sat in silence, the adrenaline buzzing like electricity. Jack rested the gun on the dashboard and stared through the rain-smeared glass. "We'll wait here until it's clear," he said. Clara nodded weakly, clutching her wound. The faint light from the dash illuminated her face, pale, streaked with dirt, but still composed. "Why are you helping me?" she asked after a while. Jack didn't answer immediately. He thought of Lena again, of how her small hand had felt in his when she was Noah's age, how helpless he had been the night he lost her. Maybe it wasn't about helping Clara. Maybe it was about trying, for once, not to fail someone again. Finally, he said, "Because somebody has to." Rex pressed his head against Clara's arm, as if to comfort her. She smiled faintly, running her fingers through his wet fur. "He's a good dog." "The best," Jack said quietly. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. The rain began to ease, leaving behind a thick mist that wrapped the forest like breath. Jack holstered his gun, feeling its weight settle against his hip. Heavy but familiar, like an old guilt returning home. He turned the key halfway, the dashboard lights flickering to life. "We'll get you to that clinic," he said, voice low but resolute. "But after tonight, nothing in Boulder Creek stays buried." Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking toward the noise. The ghosts of his past weren't done with him yet. Autumn came softly to Napa Valley, painting the vineyards in shades of gold and rust. The mornings carried a crisp chill that hung in the air long after the sun had risen, and by evening, the wind would whisper through the fields, scattering leaves across the narrow gravel paths. In the courtyard of a quiet cafe called the Lantern House, Ethan Miller waited, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked out toward the road, watching as the last rays of light flickered across the glass storefronts. His gray jacket was neatly pressed, but his sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms marked by faint scars from years of mechanical work. His brown hair had grown slightly longer since summer, and a day's stubble shaded his jaw, giving him the air of a man who worked harder than he rested. Across the street, Claire Harrington parked her car and stepped out, the wind tugging at her chestnut hair. She wore a camel-colored coat and a scarf the color of burnt orange that matched the season's palette. Her slender frame moved with quiet confidence, though there was still something fragile in her posture. The way her hands tucked into her sleeves, as if protecting herself from more than the cold. When she smiled at Ethan, it wasn't practiced or polite. It was soft, hesitant, and real. "Sorry I'm late," she said as she reached his table. "Traffic near the vineyards was awful." "Don't worry," Ethan replied, standing to pull out her chair. "I'm used to waiting." She gave him a curious look, sensing the double meaning, but said nothing. They had been meeting like this for several weeks, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks through the valley where the vines stretched endlessly under the golden sun. It wasn't formal or expected. It simply was. As they spoke about small things, work, books, the stubbornness of grapevines, their conversations drifted slowly toward the parts of themselves they usually kept hidden. Claire told him about Michael, her late husband, a doctor who had volunteered during the wildfire evacuations 3 years ago. He never made it home. "I used to believe the world was predictable," she said, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. "You work hard, love deeply, do everything right, and still, it burns." Her voice trembled slightly, then steadied. "Some days I still wake up expecting him to walk through the door." Ethan listened quietly, the way men who have learned patience do. His eyes met hers, warm but shadowed. "I know that feeling," he said, waking up to the sound of a voice that's not there anymore. "Sarah, my wife, she used to hum while she cooked. I still hear it sometimes in the kitchen fan." There was no awkward silence between them, only the shared understanding of two people who knew loss intimately. Around them, the world went on. People laughing over lattes, the clink of spoons on porcelain. But it felt distant, like another universe. It became a pattern. Ethan would visit the cafe every Saturday morning, and Claire would meet him after her painting sessions. Sometimes she brought Max, her German shepherd, now fully recovered from the limp he had from years ago. Max was 6, powerful and regal, his coat gleaming under the autumn light. His deep brown eyes carried a wisdom that only old souls seemed to possess. Despite his protective nature, he had taken an unexpected liking to Noah, Ethan's son. The first time Claire invited them to her home, a modest villa on the outskirts of town, surrounded by olive trees. Noah had been shy, hiding behind his father's leg. But when Max trotted forward, tail wagging, the boy's eyes lit up. Within minutes, they were playing fetch across the yard, laughter echoing through the crisp air. Claire had stood by the porch, her hand resting on the railing, watching the scene unfold with a mix of joy and ache. It had been so long since the sound of laughter filled her home. Max doesn't trust people easily, she admitted later, as Ethan helped her clear the table. But with Noah, it's like he remembers how to play. Maybe he sees what's good in people faster than we do, Ethan said, glancing toward the yard where the boy and the dog rolled in the grass. Days grew shorter, and their meetings became quieter, more meaningful. Ethan began helping Claire repair small things around her property. A broken hinge, a flickering light, a jammed window. His hands were steady, precise, always gentle with whatever he touched. Claire, watching him work, realized how long it had been since she'd allowed someone into her world, not to fix it, but simply to share it. Then came the night of the break-in. It was late, the moon half hidden behind clouds. Claire had been working on a new painting in her studio, the soft strains of piano music playing in the background. Max lay near the door, dozing. A sudden noise, glass shattering in the kitchen, snapped him awake. He leapt to his feet, barking furiously. Claire's heart pounded as she saw a shadow move near the window. Before she could react, Max lunged. There was a scuffle, a grunt, and then a scream. By the time Ethan arrived, she had called him in panic. The intruder had fled into the night, leaving behind drops of blood and a frightened household. Max was limping, a shallow cut along his side. Ethan knelt beside the dog, his voice calm but firm. "Easy, boy, you did good." He cleaned the wound carefully, his rough hands surprisingly tender. Claire sat nearby, trembling, watching him wrap the bandage. "You've done this before," she said softly. "Too many times," Ethan replied without looking up. "Back when Sarah was sick, hospitals, first aid, learning because I had to." Max nuzzled his palm when he finished, letting out a soft whine. Ethan smiled faintly. "You'll be fine, soldier." That night, after the police left and the quiet returned, Claire poured 2 glasses of wine and joined Ethan on the porch. The yard was still scattered with broken glass, the smell of rain drifting in from the hills. "I thought I'd stopped being afraid," she said, "but tonight it felt like losing everything again." Ethan turned toward her, his voice low. "Fear doesn't mean you're weak. It just means something still matters." For a long while they said nothing. The moon emerged fully from the clouds, washing them both in silver light. Inside, Max slept near the fireplace. Noah curled up beside him, the two of them breathing in sync. Claire followed Ethan's gaze and smiled faintly. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, something wordless passed between them, a fragile thread of trust, woven from pain and gentleness. From a distance, across the street where the porch lights faded into darkness, Richard Harrington stood near his car, unseen. The wind tugged at his coat as he watched the scene. His sister laughing softly for the first time in years, the boy chasing leaves, the dog resting peacefully. He exhaled, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet relief. His plan, born from gratitude, had grown into something more, something healing. He turned away, whispering to himself, Maybe some things were meant to be rebuilt, even after the fire. The first light of morning spread gently across the hills of Boulder Creek, painting the mist in shades of gold and pale rose. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of wet pine and smoke. The storm had passed, but the land still bore its scars. Fallen branches, broken fences, the smell of earth torn open. Jack Turner stood at the edge of the meadow behind his cabin, his weathered boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. He looked older than he had the night before, his lined face marked by exhaustion, but also by something lighter, almost peaceful. The sun caught in his gray-streaked beard, and for once, the hard set of his jaw softened. He had lived through too many nights of regret, but this dawn felt different. Down the hill, police sirens echoed faintly, growing louder as a convoy of federal vehicles rolled through the narrow road leading into town. The black SUVs gleamed against the rising sun, their tires crunching over gravel. The lead car stopped near the burned-out warehouse where the confrontation had ended hours ago. Federal agents, men and women in dark jackets, stepped out, efficient and silent. Among them was Agent Rebecca Hayes, a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and calm. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and the faint lines at the corners of her mouth hinted at years spent carrying other people's truths. She was tall, with an athletic build and an air of quiet authority. She spoke little, listened much, and was known for her unflinching sense of justice. She walked up to Jack, nodding politely. "Mr. Turner, I understand you were the one who called it in." Jack's voice was gravelly but steady. "Didn't have much choice. The sheriff's been playing both sides for years. Guess I just didn't want to look the other way anymore." Rebecca's gaze flicked toward the warehouse below, now surrounded by local deputies who looked uneasy under federal supervision. "You did the right thing," she said. "Your statement matches what we found. Illegal trafficking ring right under the department's nose. Sheriff Douglas is in custody." At the mention of the name, Jack's expression hardened. Douglas Reed, the town sheriff, had been a heavy-set man with graying hair, a deep southern drawl, and a smile that never reached his eyes. For years, he'd been a friend, or at least that's what Jack had thought. They had served together when Jack was sheriff, two men trying to hold order in a town that didn't want to change. But after the fire that claimed Jack's daughter, Emily, Douglas had turned cold, indifferent. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, but now Jack knew the truth. Douglas had been taking bribes, turning a blind eye to the same men who had burned down the house that killed his little girl. "He was there that night," Jack said quietly. "The night of the fire. He knew what was happening." Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a moment, her gray eyes softening. "You've carried that a long time, haven't you?" "Long enough," Jack said. His voice cracked slightly, though he didn't try to hide it. A few yards away, Clara was sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a gray blanket, her hair tangled but her face calm for the first time in days. Her green eyes followed the scene quietly. In her arms, Rex rested his great head, his ears twitching at every sound. The German shepherd's bandaged paw lay across her lap, and when she stroked his fur, he sighed deeply, content. Clara looked small next to the dog, her frame delicate but unbroken. The bruises on her arm had already begun to fade, but the strength in her gaze was new, a steady flame where there once had been only trembling. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Rex's tail thumped softly against the porch. Ethan's pickup, still dented from the chase, was parked nearby. He had left before dawn to help the officers with their reports, but his presence lingered in the small acts around the cabin. The kettle left warm on the stove, the blanket draped over a chair. Clara smiled faintly, remembering his quiet assurance when everything had felt hopeless. Jack turned toward her, walking slowly up the steps. His limp was heavier this morning, the years pressing on his bones. "They'll take care of it from here," he said. "You're safe now." Clara looked up at him. "I don't want to leave," she said simply. "There's too much broken here, and I think maybe it's time something good grew from it." Jack frowned slightly. "You've got a life waiting for you somewhere else?" She shook her head. "Maybe I used to, but not anymore." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed, a weary smile tugging at his lips. "What are you thinking?" "I was thinking," she said, glancing at Rex. "This town could use a shelter, a place for animals like him, and maybe for women like me." For a moment, the idea hung in the cool air, fragile but alive. Jack looked out toward the fields, where the light was growing stronger, and nodded slowly. "A rescue center," he murmured. "Boulder Creek Animal and Hope Sanctuary." He chuckled under his breath. "Got a nice ring to it." Clara's smile widened. "Then we start with that." Rex barked once, as if in agreement, his tail sweeping the porch. Jack reached down to scratch the dog's ear. "Guess that settles it." By mid-morning, the federal team had left, the road cleared of flashing lights. The town was waking to a new kind of quiet, the kind that follows truth after years of silence. Jack returned to the meadow one last time. The grass there was golden, swaying under the soft wind. In the center stood a small oak tree, young but sturdy. Beneath it lay a flat stone marked simply, "Emily Turner, beloved daughter." He crouched beside it, resting his hand on the cool surface. "It's done now, sweetheart," he murmured. "They won't hurt anyone else. I finally did what I should have done years ago." His voice caught, rough and low. "I hope that means I can stop running from you." For a long while he stayed there, the wind tugging gently at his coat, the sunlight spreading warmth across the hill. When he finally rose, the weight in his shoulders seemed lighter. Back at the cabin, Clara stood by the porch railing watching him return. Her blanket had slipped down her shoulders, and the early sun painted her face in soft gold. "You okay?" she asked. Jack nodded, looking past her to the valley below. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time in a long while." Rex stretched lazily at her feet, then settled again, eyes half closed, his ears flicking toward the distant sound of the wind in the trees. The dog seemed at peace, his body relaxed, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though guarding the line between what was gone and what had just begun. And when the last of the morning mist lifted, Boulder Creek felt almost new again, a town washed clean by truth, bound not by ghosts, but by the quiet promise of healing. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles wrapped in light or thunder. Sometimes, He sends them quietly, in the shape of a man who decides to forgive himself, a woman who dares to begin again, or a loyal German shepherd who refuses to give up on love. Jack Turner thought he had lost everything the night the fire took his daughter, but through Clara and Rex, he discovered that healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about letting God turn ashes into something new. In every broken heart, there's still a heartbeat of grace. In every lonely morning, there's a whisper of hope. Maybe the true miracle is not that God takes away our suffering, but that He walks beside us through it. Through fear, through loss, through the long nights, until we see the sunrise again. If you've ever felt lost, remember this. No story is too broken for God to rewrite. No wound is too deep for love to reach. And no life, however scarred, is beyond the touch of redemption. May God bless every soul watching this story today. May He grant you peace in your storms, strength in your trials, and light in your darkest hours. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to help spread more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. Because every time you share a story of kindness, you become part of the miracle too.